Good afternoon, everyone. um, this video lecture will be about the Heather Douglas reading titled The Moral Responsibility of Scientists. That's one of your other assigned readings for this week. And then I'm also going to discuss after I do the Douglas reading, the reading from the Eliot text from chapter 5, which is about it's very much related to the Douglas article, as you'll see, and I'll say more about that at the end. But um, in terms of this Heather Douglas reading, this is a chapter from a larger book that she wrote titled "Science, Policy, and the Value-Free Ideal," and Douglas is, as I mentioned in the video on Eliot for chapter 1, Douglas is engaging with an argument against the backdrop of this thing called the value-free ideal that wants to try and argue that scientists ought to remain insulated from value considerations. In some ways, because the work of scientists is so important, because of the burden that it would place on scientists to have to worry about value considerations, they should be exempt from certain value considerations. And also, there again goes back to this point about the incommensurability of science as a descriptive, neutral, value-free enterprise and value considerations, other value-laden spheres of our lives, like morality and politics and religion, that there is just a fundamental kind of incommensurability between these two things, and therefore we don't need to think of science as being influenced by values. Or if it is, we need to figure out ways in which we can try and insulate scientists from that. Now, Douglas, in her article, is in particular concerned with a specific kind of value influence, which is an influence of moral values. And so, what Douglas wants to ask in this essay is whether or not scientists, because of their special sort of professional status as scientists, whether that should insulate them from being held morally responsible, but being held morally responsible for a particular kind of thing. So that's what Douglas is going to be dealing with. Douglas is going to be dealing with a particular kind of moral responsibility. Because, of course, most of you would already say that scientists need to be held morally responsible for certain kinds of things. We have things like ethics review boards and internal review boards. We already recognize that scientists shouldn't, mistreat their research subjects, and that scientists shouldn't falsify data, that there are certain standards and codes inherent to what it means to be a scientist that scientists shouldn't violate. But Douglas is kind of bracketing that and saying it's kind of obvious to recognize that's not. Otherwise, you wouldn't really need convinced that scientists need to be held morally responsible for mistreating. You wouldn't need to be convinced of those things. That they're just obvious so much as to not be argued for. But Douglas wants to go a bit further and argue that when scientists make certain kinds of claims to the public, in particular, she is focused on the role of the policy advisor, a scientist who serves in government, for example, and is advising politicians about certain policies that have scientific implications. And so, and this has become increasingly common because of how integrated science has become within society, especially during the 20th century. So the role of the scientist as policy advisor is increasingly common. But Douglas's argument has implications for many other any environment in which a scientist has to communicate with the public in some kind of public forum. Douglas's argument will have implications for them as well. So this is important because a lot of scientists have to interact with the public. Not every, it's not the case that every scientist simply works in a lab somewhere and never comes into the contact with the public. So it's not only the claims that they make, verbally at a press conference or something like that, or if they're being interviewed on the news, but it's also what is it that they themselves write in their lab reports and in their journal articles that get published and widely circulated into the public. What is it that they say there? So when she says that they can be held responsible for the claims, she means claims, verbal claims when they are in front of the public, literally, and written claims in their actual articles and their research. So that's kind of what Douglas is up to. But Douglas starts from asking a basic question, and this is a lot of times what philosophers will do. She wants to step back and say, what does it mean to hold somebody morally responsible? Because we say it all the time. We say, for example, that is wrong, or that you've done something wrong. And Douglas is saying, well, what do we mean by that? When we say somebody has done something wrong, what do we mean? What is behind the meaning of wrongness? What does wrongness consist in? Or when we praise somebody for doing something right, not just blame, but praise as well. And Douglas wants to make an immediate distinction. What moral responsibility consists in is that it has to do with something that we intended to bring about through our actions, through our choices. It's something that we meant to bring about and that we can be praised or blamed for. So to hold somebody responsible is to be able to praise or blame them. Now, she makes a distinction to try to show what kinds of things wouldn't be capable of being praised and blamed. This line will not always be clear, but Douglas early on makes a distinction between causal and moral responsibility. And this is to show where moral responsibility starts and causal responsibility ends. So causal responsibility is simply being part of a chain of events, but there's no sense in which we can hold you responsible for producing some kind of action. The claim is that without you, something couldn't have happened, but you in no way are responsible for the thing that was produced. So, she gives an example that we don't hold grandparents responsible for all of the actions of their children. So if you we all have grandparents, and that we, do something really stupid. Well, we would say that our grandparents are causally responsible because without them, we wouldn't exist. But we wouldn't say that our grandparents are morally responsible because they didn't intend for us to do that thing. Saying that, if you did something really stupid and you tried to say, but I wouldn't exist if it wasn't for my grandparents, and therefore I can't be held responsible for this. Well, most people would look at you very strangely. That's not something that we would recognize as a legitimate explanation. So therefore, causal responsibility is simply being part of a causal chain. The thing couldn't have existed without you, but that is not necessary or sufficient to hold somebody morally responsible. A moral responsibility has to do with something that you intended to bring about, and that you can be praised or blamed for. So if I walk over to somebody and I kick them really hard and it hurts, I can be held responsible for that. Because I intended to do the thing and I succeeded. Now, if I go over to somebody and kick them, and even if I don't hurt them, I can still be blamed for that. So, these are stupid examples, but praise and blame are the marks of moral responsibility. We assume that the person could have chosen to do otherwise, but proceeded to do the thing. Again, I'm focusing more on blame here, but we can also praise individuals. So we don't just blame moral responsibility is not only about blame; it's also about praise. That you do a good action or you perform a good action, and we praise you for it. So that is how she's going to establish what moral responsibility is early on. That we are morally responsible for actions that we intend, that for the consequences of our actions that we intend to bring about, and that we can be praised or blamed on that basis. However, there are lots of consequences from our actions that are unintended, that we maybe didn't foresee, but yet we also might want to hold others responsible for those things. We would want to, because we need to have some accountability, even if not every action is something that we could have foreseen. We need to ask, but did you engage in some kind of thought process? Is there evidence that you engaged in a reasonable thought process that shows that you at least try to anticipate certain consequences, even if they weren't preventable? You could still be held responsible because you didn't take the time to think them through. And so there's within the law, there is a distinction between holding somebody criminally negligent and criminally reckless. And Douglas uses this distinction between negligence and reckless and tries to use it as a way to make sense of which unintended consequences we can hold people responsible for. And the category of recklessness is a category. When we say somebody was reckless, we say that they clearly saw the results of their actions, but yet they proceeded anyways in the face of danger. And therefore, we would hold them reckless. And that is a clear case of when we can hold them responsible. That they thought about the consequences, and they proceeded anyways. The other category of negligence is that somebody should have known but didn't, and they unknowingly create risk and harm to others as a result of their choices and a result of their actions. It is a lesser standard of holding somebody responsible. We don't think that somebody is as bad of a person if they are negligent, but nonetheless, they should have foreseen the consequences but didn't. And so therefore, we can say that they were negligent. And so reckless and negligence are two categories that we can use to make sense of how we can hold someone responsible for the unintended consequences of their actions. And let's be honest, a lot of the consequences of our actions and our choices are things we may not have been able to foresee. And so that's why we need to have this category, because the intended ones are easy. If I walk over to you, I kick you, I obviously knew it was going to hurt. Well, that one's easy. But what about the unintended ones? What if you develop later you're an athlete and you develop, you develop a sore ankle and you claim that it was me? Well, I don't know. Should I have known that? Well, I mean, again, this is a stupid example, but should I have known you were an athlete? Should I have been aware of that before I kicked you? Well, probably. So maybe I was negligent. So anyways, I know that's a stupid example, but it's just trying to get at the fact that unintended consequences can show up a lot later, and yet we still want to be able to assume that we can hold someone responsible. Now, you may say, well, what does all of this have to do with scientists? What on earth? What does any of this have to do with scientists? Well, Douglas is trying to bring it back to scientists, and now she's going to say that in fact, because her argument is about the claims that scientists make, the kinds of claims that they make in public and in their written research, she wants to say that the claims that we make are also a kind of action. So in the same way that we can hold somebody responsible for kicking someone, we can also hold somebody responsible for the claims that they make. Claims are an action in the same way that other kinds of actions are actions, that they fall under the same heading of action, and therefore we can be held morally responsible for the things that we say, that our claims have consequences, and that we can be held responsible for them. So Douglas gives the example of a briefcase being found in a classroom. I usually, when I teach this, I use this example. So if there's a briefcase up in front of a classroom, and no professor is around, and you see the briefcase, and you decide to yell, bomb, bomb, there's a bomb in the building, and you go crazy. Well, you can be held responsible for that, not only legally but morally responsible, because you acted recklessly. You could have easily foreseen that that would have caused a panic. Now, if you decide that you're going to take the briefcase, or if you're going to call somebody else to come look at it, there are a number of other actions you could take. But the idea is, based on the action you performed, what evidence do we have that you thought about the consequences? And if we have no evidence, then we can hold you morally responsible. And if we have evidence that you did, then we can not hold you as accountable as we would if you hadn't thought about your actions at all. So anyways, Douglas's argument is simply that there's nothing about scientists that would exempt them from the same general moral responsibility that we hold everyone else to on a daily basis. And this general account of moral responsibility is simply the idea that me and you and everyone else on a daily basis, you expect other people to think about the consequences of the things that they say. That when somebody says something to you, they think about the consequences of that. They engage in a thoughtful process about what might happen if I say this thing. And that Douglas is saying, because scientists inhabit this role as public advisors, they are just as responsible for the claims they make as everyone else is. And so that's her argument, right? There's nothing about scientists that exempts them from this, right? And so that's what her argument is about. And so that's really what she's up to in today's reading, is to try to make the case that scientists can be held morally responsible for the claims that they make. Now, there's another distinction that Douglas makes within this article. I forget the specific page that it appears on, but there are all these sets of distinctions. We've discussed causal and moral, reckless and negligence. The third set of distinctions that Douglas introduces is a distinction between general responsibilities and role responsibilities. Now, general responsibilities have to do with what we've just been discussing. The role that qua human being, as a human being, we all have a general responsibility to consider the consequences of our actions. But somebody might argue that scientists, because of their role responsibilities, because they are so important, because they inhabit a role in society in producing knowledge and fighting disease and curing disease and producing new breakthroughs to help us, solve the climate crisis, for example, because the demands on them are so great because of their jobs, they should be insulated from their more general responsibility. That their role responsibility would exempt them from their general responsibility to consider the consequences of the claims that they make. And Douglas says there's really no evidence to suggest that that should be the case, that there's nothing about their role as a scientist that should exempt them. On the one hand, she says that scientists are actually in the best position to be able to evaluate the consequences of their action. And so, in fact, it's in their roles as scientists that they are uniquely qualified to evaluate the consequences. And so, therefore, if anything, their role responsibilities are evidence for having general responsibility. And one of the other, so that's an objection she's considering. And then there's another objection that Douglas considers, which is that that the value of knowledge is so important that we don't want to weigh down the scientists. We don't want to burden the scientists with having to think about moral responsibilities, because a scientist already has so much responsibility on them that if we ask them to think about the consequences of their actions all the time, then they will not perform their job as a scientist as well. And so this would be an argument that the role of knowledge, the epistemic value, epistemic referring to knowledge, always outweighs the social value or the moral value. And Douglas's response to that is that there's actually evidence. She gives an example of several different examples in her essay of scientists actually engaging in this kind of moral deliberation. And so there's no evidence to suggest that scientists don't do this. And she also says that the more dangerous path, that in fact, the opposite is true. It's not the morally responsible scientist that we should worry about. It's the value-free scientist that we should worry about. We should be more concerned about exempting scientists rather than placing the burden on scientists. And so her response to that is actually the opposite. The position that her opponents are arguing for is the more dangerous position. And so that's what Douglas is going to say. So Douglas, later in the essay, and I want to look in particular here on page, if you look at page 81 in Douglas's article on page 81, where she says the second full paragraph, an example will help us to clarify this ideal for a fully responsible science advisor. So suppose a scientist is examining epidemiological records in conjunction with air quality standards. And the scientist notices that a particular pollutant is always conjoined with a spike in respiratory deaths, right? And so this example is that a scientist is aware of a correlation between the presence of a certain pollutant and a rise in respiratory deaths. They're aware that there is this link, but yet they're not sure about the link. And the question is, what should the scientist do? What should they say? Because in this case, public health is a very important social good. It's high on the priority list. And so the question is, how does the scientist weigh their responsibility as a scientist to only report reliable data and factual data versus getting this information out there to the public so that they're aware of it? How do they balance in their head as they deliberate? What should the deliberation look like as they think about the social value versus the epistemic value? So this is what's going on in Douglas's article. It's the weighing of these values against each other. It's a kind of cost-benefit kind of analysis. So we have kind of three options. One option could be, well, I value the knowledge so much that I'm not going to say anything. I'm in fact going to say nothing, because until I have causation or a standard of evidence that shows an absolute link between the pollutant and the public health, until I have that link, I'm going to say nothing. So that's one option. Another option could be that you actually go beyond what the data says and you say, well, there is this link, that you should avoid these areas, that the pollutant does lead to higher incidences of respiratory illness. And so you go beyond what's available to you. So on the one hand, you say nothing, and that shows that you're really weighing the epistemic. On the other hand, you go beyond, and that really shows that you're weighing the social. And so these seem to be two, ends of a spectrum here. On the one hand, you go beyond what the data says. On the other hand, you say nothing. And that shows the epistemic versus the social here. But maybe there's a middle path. And this is what Douglas's argument is going to be. That in fact, what you can do is you can actually build uncertainty into your claim. You can say because of this public health demand on me, I have to get this out there so that people are aware of it. But yet, because of my responsibility as a scientist to only report factual data, I need to be clear that there is uncertainty, that there is a link, but it is not a causal link. And so the building in of uncertainty into your claim is what Douglas would recommend here. Only in the weighing of uncertainty do social and ethical values have a legitimate role to play when deciding, based on the available evidence, which empirical claim to make. So again, the scientist has to think about if they are wrong, right? So this goes back to, we are holding the science. The point is that if the scientist makes the bold claim and says that there is a link, then and that he turns out to be wrong, well, we would want to be able to say we can hold them responsible. Now, the question is, if people, I don't know, for example, if he goes out and makes this claim that there is a link, and then people rush out and stock up on things and there's a panic, and we hold the scientists responsible for that. So this gets back into the reckless and negligence. How many unintended consequences should we hold the scientists responsible for? And the best option, it seems like, is if there is evidence in the claim that the scientist built in the uncertainty, then we are less likely to blame the scientist. And so, anyways, the overall point is Douglas doesn't want to burden the scientists and weigh them down, but we need to have evidence in the claims that they make that they have thought carefully about the consequences to the public of the claims that they're making. And so that's actually all I have on the Douglas article. I'm going to say a little bit more in the next lecture about how this is connected to Eliot's chapter 5.